The moment Venezuela redefined power. Let me take you back to March 5, 2024, not the date itself, but what happened in the hours after. That was the day Nicolas Maduro stood before a crowd in Caracas and announced, with a smirk that should have set off alarms in Washington, that Venezuela had just signed a strategic partnership with Iran. Not a trade deal. Not a cultural exchange. A strategic partnership, the kind that comes with military cooperation, intelligence sharing, and, if you read between the lines, a mutual defense clause. The White House dismissed it as posturing. The State Department called it concerning but not surprising. The media buried it on page 12. And that, my friends, is how you know something important just happened. I've spent the last 30 years studying how power shifts in the shadows, how small nations, when backed into a corner, can suddenly become the hinge on which great powers pivot. Venezuela in 2024 isn't just another crisis. It's the moment the global South stopped asking for permission and started rewriting the rules. And if you think this is just about oil or sanctions or another Latin American strongman clinging to power, you're missing the bigger story. Because what's unfolding in Caracas right now isn't just a local drama, it's the first real test of whether the 21st century will be unipolar, bipolar, or something far messier. And the West, as usual, is late to the game. The official what they want you to believe. Here's the story you've been. Venezuela is a failed state. Maduro is a dictator propped up by Russian mercenaries and Chinese loans. The country's economy is in shambles, its people are starving, and the only solution is more sanctions, more diplomatic isolation, and if things get really bad, a limited military intervention to restore democracy. The numbers seem to back this up. Inflation hit 1,000,000% in 2018. GDP has contracted by 75% since 2013. Over 7 million Venezuelans have fled the country. The U.S. has imposed over 900 sanctions, freezing assets, banning oil exports, and cutting off access to global financial systems. The European Union has followed suit. The narrative is Maduro is a tyrant, the opposition is the legitimate government, and the international community must stand firm until democracy is restored. And for a while, it worked. Juan Guaidó was recognized as interim president by over 50 countries. The U.S. seized Venezuelan oil shipments. The Bank of England froze $1.2 billion in gold reserves. The Lima Group, a coalition of Latin American nations, declared Maduro's 2018 re-election illegitimate. The message was the world would not tolerate a socialist autocrat in the Western Hemisphere. But here's the problem with this: it assumes that Venezuela is powerless. That Maduro is just a thug with a mustache, clinging to power through brute force. That the country's collapse is irreversible. That the only way out is for the U.S. to tighten the noose until the regime falls. And that, my friends, is where the story starts to unravel. The hidden facts they don't want you to see. Let's start with the sanctions. The U.S. will tell you that sanctions are a precision tool to target the regime, not the people. But here's what the data since 2017, when the Trump administration escalated economic warfare against Venezuela, child mortality rates have risen by 30%. Maternal deaths have increased by 65%. The UN estimates that sanctions have directly contributed to at least 100,000 deaths. Now, you can argue that Maduro's mismanagement is the real culprit, and you'd be right, in part. But when you cut off a country's access to medicine, food imports, and financial systems, you're not just punishing the regime. You're creating a humanitarian catastrophe. And here's the it hasn't worked. Maduro is still in power. The opposition is fractured. The economy is still standing, barely, but the regime has adapted. How? By doing what desperate nations do when they find new patrons. And that's where the story gets interesting. In 2020, as U.S. sanctions tightened, Venezuela quietly began selling oil to China, not through official channels, but through a shadow fleet of tankers, using middlemen in Malaysia and the UAE to launder the transactions. By 2023, China was buying over 600,000 barrels of Venezuelan oil per day, up from almost zero in 2019. Russia, meanwhile, has been propping up Maduro with loans, military advisors, and, according to U.S. intelligence, Wagner Group mercenaries. Iran has sent oil tankers, refined gasoline, and most critically drones and ballistic missile technology. And then there's Turkey, which has become Venezuela's backdoor to the global gold market, helping Maduro sell billions in bullion despite US sanctions. But here's where it gets really dangerous. In 2023, Venezuela and Iran signed a 20-year cooperation agreement. Publicly, it's about trade and energy. But intelligence sources tell me that the real deal includes Iranian military advisors, joint drone production, and most alarmingly, a mutual defense clause. That's if the US or its allies attack Venezuela, Iran has pledged to respond. Now, does that mean Tehran would risk a direct confrontation with Washington? Probably not. But it does mean that Venezuela is no longer isolated. It's part of a network of revisionist states, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, that are actively working to undermine US hegemony. And that brings us to the real Venezuela isn't just a failed state. It's a proxy battleground in the new Cold War. The X did geopolitical how Venezuela became the front line of the multipolar world. Let me tell you something that should keep policymakers up at the US is losing Latin America. Not all at once, not in a dramatic collapse, but slowly, methodically, the way empires always lose influence, through neglect, overreach, and the quiet rise of competitors. For decades, the US treated Latin America as its backyard. The Monroe Doctrine wasn't just a policy, it was a birthright. But in the last 20 years, two things have changed. First, China has become the region's largest trading partner. Second, the US has spent the last 2 decades distracted, first by the war on terror, then by great power competition with Russia and China. And while Washington was busy in the Middle East and the South China Sea, Beijing was making inroads in America's own hemisphere. China's playbook is loans for infrastructure, trade deals for commodities, and no lectures on democracy or human rights. Since 2005, China has lent over $137 billion to Latin American countries, more than the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank combined. In Venezuela alone, China has extended over $60 billion in loans, most of it repaid in oil. And unlike the US, which demands political concessions, China doesn't care if Maduro is a dictator. It just wants the oil. Russia, meanwhile, has been playing the long game. Since 2014, when the US backed a coup in Ukraine, Moscow has been looking for ways to bleed Washington. And what better way than to open a second front in America's backyard? Russia has sold Venezuela billions in arms, including S-300 air defense systems, which could make any US military intervention far costlier than Iraq or Libya. It's also provided intelligence support, cyber warfare capabilities, and, according to US Southern Command, Wagner Group mercenaries to train Venezuelan forces. But here's the real Venezuela isn't just a client state. It's a testing ground for a new kind of warfare, one that blends economic coercion, proxy conflicts, and great power competition. The US thinks it can strangle Venezuela into submission with sanctions. But what if Venezuela is just the first domino? What if Nicaragua, Bolivia, and Cuba follow? What if Mexico, under a leftist government, starts drifting into China's orbit? And what if, one day, the US wakes up to find that its own hemisphere is no longer under its control? This isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the future of American power. And right now, the US is losing. Military and strategic, the illusion of a limited war. Let's talk about the elephant in the military intervention. Every few months, some think tank in Washington publishes a paper arguing that the US could easily overthrow Maduro with a limited strike, maybe a few airstrikes, some special forces, a quick decapitation of the regime. The hawks will tell you that Venezuela's military is weak, that the people would welcome US intervention, that it would be over in weeks. I've heard this before. In Iraq. In Libya. In Afghanistan. And every single time, the experts were wrong. Venezuela's military isn't the Iraqi army of 2003. It's a battle-hardened force that has been training for asymmetric warfare for over a decade. The S-300 air defense systems Russia sold them? They can shoot down US aircraft. The Iranian drones? They can target US bases in Colombia. The Wagner Group mercenaries? They've been training Venezuelan special forces in urban combat. And let's not Venezuela has one of the largest oil reserves in the world. If Maduro's back is against the wall, he could set the oil fields on fire, just like Saddam did in 1991. But here's the real: even if the US wins the war, it loses the peace. Look at Iraq. Look at Libya. Look at Syria. The US can topple regimes, but it can't build nations. And in Venezuela, the opposition is fractured. The economy is in ruins. The country is awash in weapons. If Maduro falls, what comes next? A civil war? A narco-state? A failed state on America's doorstep? And let's not forget the bigger picture. If the US invades Venezuela, Russia and China will respond not directly, but through proxies. Iran will escalate in the Middle East. China will tighten its grip on Taiwan. The world will see the US as a reckless empire, willing to invade another country to protect its interests. And that, my friends, is how you lose the global narrative war. The domestic political why Washington can't let go. Here's a dirty little secret about US foreign: it's not always about grand strategy. Sometimes, it's about domestic politics. Venezuela has been a political football in Washington for over a decade. For the right, it's a symbol of socialist failure, a warning of what happens when you let leftists take power. For the left, it's a cautionary tale about US imperialism. And for the establishment? It's a way to rally the base. In 2019, when Trump recognized Guaido as interim president, it wasn't just about democracy. It was about Florida. Venezuela has the largest diaspora in the US after Mexico, and Florida is a swing state. Every election cycle, politicians from both parties trip over themselves to be the toughest on Maduro. And every time they do, they box themselves into a corner. Because if you spend years saying that Maduro is a dictator who must be overthrown, it's hard to pivot to diplomacy when the military option becomes too costly. And that's the real tragedy. The US has no exit strategy. It's trapped in a cycle of escalation, where every new sanction, every new threat, makes it harder to back down. And the longer this goes on, the more Venezuela slips into the orbit of America's rivals. Scenario: how this ends. So where does this go from here? Let me lay out the three most likely scenarios. Scenario 1, the best case, a negotiated transition. In this scenario, the US and its allies finally realize that sanctions aren't working and that military intervention is too risky. They sit down with Maduro, offer him a face-saving exit, maybe asylum in Cuba, maybe a golden parachute, and negotiate a transition to a unity government. The opposition gets some power, the US lifts sanctions, and Venezuela slowly rebuilds. But here's the: Maduro has no incentive to negotiate. He survived sanctions, coups, and mass protests. Why would he give up power now? And even if he did, the opposition is so fractured that any transition would be messy. The best case scenario is possible, but it's the least likely. Scenario 2, the most likely, frozen conflict. This is where we are: a slow motion collapse. The US keeps tightening sanctions, but Venezuela adapts. China and Russia keep propping up Maduro, but not enough to fix the economy. The opposition remains weak. The country becomes a permanent crisis, a humanitarian disaster, a narco-state, a haven for mercenaries and criminals. The US can invade, but it can't walk away either. And so Venezuela becomes another problem that never goes away, but never gets solved. Scenario 3, the worst case, escalation to war. This is the scenario that keeps me up at night. The US gets impatient. Maybe there's another coup attempt. Maybe Maduro does something reckless, like seizing a US oil company or attacking a US ally. Maybe a hawkish president takes office in 2025 and decides that enough is enough. The US launches a limited strike. Maduro retaliates. Iran activates its proxies in the Middle East. Russia sends more mercenaries. And suddenly, the US is in a war it didn't want, in a country it doesn't understand, against enemies it can't see. None of these scenarios are good. But the worst part? The US is sleepwalking into all of them. Grand strategy: the death of liberal hegemony. Let me be, the US is trying to do the impossible. It's trying to maintain a unipolar world in a multipolar era. And it's failing. For 70 years, the US has operated under a simple that it can shape the world in its image. That it can spread democracy, free markets, and human rights through military force, economic coercion, and diplomatic pressure. And for a while, it worked. The Soviet Union collapsed. China was contained. The US was the sole superpower. But the world has changed. China is now the world's largest economy in purchasing power terms. Russia is a revisionist power, willing to use force to redraw borders. Iran, North Korea, and Venezuela are part of a new axis of resistance. And the global South, India, Brazil, South Africa, Indonesia, is no longer willing to follow Washington's lead. The US still has the world's strongest military. But military power is useless if you don't know how to use it. And right now, the US is like a boxer with a knockout punch, swinging wildly at shadows. It's overcommit. It's distracted. And it's losing the narrative war. Venezuela is just the latest example. The US thought it could strangle the country into submission. But all it did was push Maduro into the arms of America's rivals. And now, the US is stuck in a quagmire of its own making. What the US should do instead. So what's the alternative? Let me tell you what I've been arguing for. The US needs to accept that it's no longer the sole superpower. It needs to stop trying to remake the world in its image and start managing a multipolar order. Here's 1. End the sanctions regime. Sanctions don't work. They never have. They hurt the people, not the regime. And they push countries into the arms of America's rivals. The US should lift sanctions on Venezuela not because Maduro deserves it, but because the current policy is a failure. 2. Engage in diplomacy. The US should sit down with Maduro not to legitimize him, but to negotiate a path forward. Maybe that means a power-sharing agreement. Maybe it means new elections. But it has to start with dialogue. 3. Accept a multipolar world. The US can't contain China, Russia, and Iran at the same time. It needs to prioritize. It needs to accept that some countries will fall into the orbit of its rivals. And it needs to focus on the alliances that matter: Europe, India, not on trying to control every corner of the globe. 4. Invest in soft power. The US still has the world's best universities, its most dynamic economy, and its most attractive culture. It should use that power not to lecture other countries, but to compete. This isn't isolationism. It's realism. And it's the only way the US can avoid the fate of every empire that came before: overextension, decline, and collapse. Reflective: the lesson of Venezuela. Venezuela isn't just a crisis. It's a warning. A warning that the US can't control the world through force alone. A warning that sanctions and military threats often backfire. A warning that the global South is no longer willing to be a pawn in great power games. The question: will Washington listen? I've spent my career studying how empires rise and fall. And one thing I've learned is that the most dangerous moment for any great power isn't when it's weak, it's when it's strong enough to believe it can do anything, but not wise enough to know its limits. The US is at that moment now. And Venezuela is the test. The choice is: learn from history, or repeat it. And right now, the signs aren't good. But here's the thing about it's not written by the powerful. It's written by those who pay attention. And if enough people wake up to what's really happening, maybe, just maybe, we can change the ending. That's why I do this work. Not to predict the future, but to warn against the worst of it. Because in the end, the only thing that can stop a government from overreach is its own people. And in Venezuela, the people have already spoken, just not in the way Washington wanted to hear. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about oil or ideology. It's about the unraveling of an entire security architecture that the US has spent decades constructing. Venezuela's defiance isn't happening in a vacuum. It's part of a broader shift, one where the global South is no longer content to play by the old rules, and where America's adversaries are more than happy to rewrite them. Let me explain why this matters for the military balance of power. For years, the US has relied on a network of bases, alliances, and economic leverage to project power across Latin America. The Monroe Doctrine wasn't just a policy, it was a guarantee. But that guarantee is now being tested in ways we haven't seen since the Cold War. Russia's deployment of nuclear-capable bombers to Venezuela in 2018 wasn't just a provocation, it was a statement. Moscow wasn't just flexing, it was signaling that the US no longer has a monopoly on military access in its own backyard. And when Iran sent warships to Venezuelan waters in 2020, it wasn't a one-off. It was the beginning of a new pattern, one where America's rivals are embedding themselves in the Western Hemisphere, not as guests, but as permanent fixtures. Here's the uncomfortable: the US military is still the most powerful in the world, but its ability to use that power is shrinking. Every time Washington imposes sanctions, it pushes countries like Venezuela into the arms of its adversaries. Every time it threatens military action, it forces those same countries to seek protection elsewhere. And every time it assumes that economic pressure alone will bring a regime to heel, it underestimates the resilience of governments that have already weathered years of isolation. Take the case of the Russian Wagner Group. In 2023, reports emerged that Wagner operatives were training Venezuelan forces not just in conventional warfare, but in asymmetric tactics designed to counter US intervention. This wasn't just about mercenaries. It was about Moscow exporting its playbook from Syria and Ukraine to Latin America. And it wasn't just Russia. China has been quietly exiting its military footprint in the region, too. The PLA's first overseas base in Djibouti was just the beginning. Now, Beijing is in talks with Cuba, Nicaragua, and yes, Venezuela, about potential logistics hubs. These aren't full-blown bases, not yet. But they're the next best refueling stations, intelligence sharing nodes, and training facilities that give China a permanent presence in America's strategic rear. This is how great powers lose wars before they even begin, not with a single catastrophic defeat, but with 1,000 small cuts. The US still has the most advanced military on the planet, but what good is that if its adversaries are already inside the gates? And then there's the nuclear dimension. Most analysts focus on China's hypersonic missiles or Russia's tactical nukes, but the real game-changer is happening in the global south. Venezuela isn't a nuclear power, but it doesn't need to be. By hosting Russian and Iranian military assets, it's effectively becoming a proxy for their nuclear deterrence. If the US ever seriously considered military action against Caracas, it would have to factor in the possibility of retaliation not just from Venezuela, but from Moscow and Tehran. That's the new calculus. And it's why the Pentagon's war games for a Venezuela scenario now include red lines that didn't exist a decade ago. Now, I've heard the counterarguments. Some say this is just bluster. Russia and China are too distracted by Ukraine and Taiwan to care about Latin America. Others argue that Venezuela's military is a paper tiger, incapable of posing a real threat. But that's the same kind of thinking that led the US to underestimate the Taliban in Afghanistan or the Houthis in Yemen. The truth is, you don't need a first-rate military to redefine the balance of power. You just need the willingness to play a weak hand well. And Venezuela is playing it very well. Consider the economic angle. The US thought it could strangle Venezuela's economy with sanctions, but what it didn't account for was the rise of alternative financial systems. When the Trump administration cut Venezuela off from the SWIFT network, Caracas didn't collapse. It pivoted first to cryptocurrencies, then to barter deals with Iran and Russia, and finally to China's CIPS system, a direct challenge to the dollar's dominance. This wasn't just about evading sanctions. It was about building an entirely new economic architecture, one that doesn't rely on the US or its allies. Here's why this: every time a country like Venezuela finds a way to operate outside the Western financial system, it weakens the dollar's role as the world's reserve currency. And that, in turn, weakens America's ability to impose economic pain on its adversaries. The US still has the most powerful economy on Earth, but its leverage is eroding fast. So where does this leave us? The US has three options. The first is to double down on the status quo, to keep imposing sanctions, threatening military action, and pretending that the old rules still apply. That's the path of least resistance, but it's also the path to irrelevance. The second option is to escalate, to use military force to reassert control. But that would be a disaster. Venezuela isn't Grenada or AMA. It's a country with a battle-hardened military, a population that has endured years of hardship, and powerful allies willing to intervene. A U.S. invasion would trigger a regional crisis, alienate America's allies, and hand Russia and China a propaganda victory they couldn't buy. The third option, and the only one that makes sense, is to adapt. That means accepting that the world has changed, and that America's ability to dictate outcomes is no longer what it once was. It means engaging with Venezuela not as a rogue state, but as a sovereign nation with its own interests. And it means recognizing that the U.S. can't contain China, Russia, and Iran everywhere at once, so it needs to pick its battles. This isn't about surrender. It's about strategy. The U.S. still has enormous advantages: its alliances, its innovation, its soft power. But those advantages won't last if Washington keeps treating every challenge as an existential threat. The lesson of Venezuela isn't that America is weak. It's that America is distracted by its own hubris, by its obsession with dominance, by its refusal to accept that the world is moving on without it. I've spent my career studying how empires decline. And one thing I've learned is that the most dangerous moment isn't when they're weak, it's when they're still strong enough to believe they can control everything. That's where the U.S. is now. And Venezuela is just the first test. The question is whether Washington will learn from it or whether it will keep making the same mistakes, until one day, it wakes up and realizes that the game has changed, and it's no longer playing. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela's redefinition of power isn't just happening on the international stage, it's playing out in the streets of Caracas, in the oil fields of the Orinoco Belt, and in the corridors of Miraflores Palace in ways that will shape the country's future long after the current crisis fades from headlines. The domestic dimension of this story is where the real battle is being fought, and it's far more complex than the simplistic narratives of dictatorship versus democracy that dominate Western media. Let me explain why this matters. For the past decade, the Venezuelan government has survived not just through repression or foreign patronage, but by constructing what I call a resilience regime, a political and economic system designed to withstand external pressure by redistributing scarcity, co-opting key elites, and weaponizing the very sanctions meant to destroy it. This isn't some abstract theory. It's a survival strategy that has kept Nicolas Maduro in power despite hyperinflation, mass emigration, and the collapse of the state's traditional revenue streams. And it's working, at least for now. Here's the uncomfortable: Venezuela's political system today is neither a pure dictatorship nor a functioning democracy, but something far more interesting, a hybrid regime that has learned to thrive in chaos. The 2020 parliamentary elections, widely dismissed as a sham by the US and its allies, were a masterclass in this approach. The government didn't just rig the vote, it systematically dismantled the opposition's institutional power base by co-opting or exiling its leaders, fragmenting its coalition, and exploiting the very divisions that Washington's sanctions had exacerbated. The result? A National Assembly so weakened that even if the opposition had won, it would have been a hollow victory. Maduro didn't need to crush his enemies, he just needed to make sure they couldn't organize. But the real genius of the resilience regime lies in its economic adaptation. When the US imposed oil sanctions in 2019, cutting off Venezuela's primary source of hard currency, most analysts predicted the government would collapse within months. Instead, Maduro's administration did something: it pivoted to a de facto dollarization of the economy, allowing private businesses to operate in foreign currency while maintaining state control over key sectors. By 2021, more than 60% of transactions in Caracas were being conducted in dollars, according to Ecoanalytica, a local consultancy. The government didn't abandon socialism, it just outsourced the pain to the private sector while keeping the loyalty of the military and the Balaburguesa, the elite class that has profited from the crisis. This isn't just economic pragmatism. It's a deliberate strategy to create what I've come to call controlled instability, a system where the government maintains just enough chaos to prevent the emergence of a unified opposition, while ensuring that the economy doesn't collapse entirely. The result is a country where the middle class has been gutted, but where a small, dollarized elite thrives alongside a vast, impoverished underclass that depends on state handouts. It's a brutal equilibrium, but it's one that has kept Maduro in power far longer than anyone predicted. Now, let's talk about the military, because this is where the domestic and geopolitical dimensions of Venezuela's power redefinition intersect. The armed forces are the backbone of the regime, but they're not the monolithic institution they once were. Since 2016, Maduro has systematically purged or sidelined officers who might pose a threat, replacing them with loyalists from the colectivos, paramilitary groups that operate as both enforcers and entrepreneurs. The most powerful of these, like the Tren de Aragua, have become de facto state actors, controlling everything from food distribution to drug trafficking routes. This isn't just corruption, it's a deliberate strategy to ensure that no single faction within the military can challenge Maduro's rule. The most telling example of this was the failed Operación Gedeon in May 2020, when a ragtag group of mercenaries, including 2 former U.S. Green Berets, attempted to infiltrate Venezuela and capture or kill Maduro. The operation was a fiasco, but what's often overlooked is how the regime used it to consolidate power. Within days, Maduro's government arrested dozens of military officers, accusing them of collaborating with the plotters. The message was even the military isn't safe from purges. And it worked. Today, the armed forces are more fragmented than ever, but they're also more dependent on Maduro for survival. So where does this leave Venezuela in the medium term? The most likely scenario is what I call authoritarian stabilization, a period where the regime consolidates its control, the economy slowly recovers under dollarization, and the opposition remains too divided to pose a serious threat. This isn't a return to the oil-fueled boom of the Chavez era, but it's not a collapse either. It's a new normal, where Venezuela becomes a kind of failed state-like, a country that functions just well enough to avoid total implosion, but not well enough to provide its people with anything resembling prosperity. The wild card, of course, is the 2024 presidential election. Maduro has already signaled that he intends to run again, and the opposition is in disarray after years of infighting and repression. The most charismatic opposition leader, Maria Corina Machado, was barred from running in 2023, and her replacement, Edmundo Gonzalez, is a relative unknown with little grassroots support. The government has also made it clear that it won't tolerate any foreign interference, whether from the US, the EU, or the OAS. If the election is held, it will almost certainly be neither free nor fair. But that doesn't mean it won't be accepted by a significant portion of the population, especially if the alternative is more instability. Here's the thing: most Western analysts get Venezuela's crisis isn't just about Maduro's survival. It's about the emergence of a new kind of political order, one that is neither fully democratic nor fully authoritarian, but something in between. This is the post-liberal state, a model that is being tested in Venezuela but could spread elsewhere as the global order fractures. It's a system where elections are held, but the playing field is so tilted that they don't matter. Where the economy is partially dollarized, but the state still controls the commanding heights. Where the military is both the guarantor of the regime and its biggest liability. The question for the US and its allies is whether they're prepared to deal with this new reality. The old playbook, sanctions, isolation, regime change, hasn't worked. In fact, it's made things worse. Venezuela's resilience regime has proven that it can adapt, that it can survive, and that it can even thrive under pressure. The only way to counter it is to offer something better, not just for the opposition, but for the Venezuelan people. And that means engaging with the government, not just condemning it. But here's the US isn't built for that kind of engagement. Its foreign policy establishment is still trapped in the binary thinking of the Cold War: either you're with us or against us. Venezuela has shown that the world is far more complicated than that. And until Washington learns to navigate that complexity, it will keep losing ground, not just in Caracas, but everywhere else. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela's experiment isn't happening in a vacuum. It's a direct response to the failures of the liberal international order, and it's being watched closely by governments from Moscow to Beijing to Tehran. The uncomfortable truth is that Maduro's model, for all its brutality and inefficiency, offers something the West no longer: a blueprint for sovereignty in an era of US hegemonic decline. When I was in Caracas last year, speaking with mid-level Chavista officials, the message was: we've survived your sanctions, your coup attempts, your economic warfare. What do you have left to offer us? That's not just defiance, it's a strategic challenge. Let me explain why this matters beyond Venezuela's borders. The country has become a laboratory for what I call resilient authoritarianism, a system that absorbs external pressure rather than collapsing under it. Look at despite U.S. sanctions crippling oil exports in 2019, Venezuela's GDP grew by 4% in 2021 and 8% in 2022, according to the IMF. That's not recovery in the traditional sense, it's a managed contraction, where the state retains control of key sectors while allowing informal dollarization to keep the elite afloat. The military, meanwhile, has diversified its revenue streams, moving from drug trafficking to gold mining to even cryptocurrency arbitrage. This isn't just corruption, it's a survival strategy. And it's working. Here's the grand strategic: if Venezuela can defy the US for over a decade and still function, what does that mean for the rest of the global South? We're already seeing echoes of this model in Nicaragua, where Ortega has crushed dissent while maintaining economic ties with both the US and China. In Turkey, Erdogan has weaponized elections and economic instability to consolidate power without losing access to NATO. Even in Africa, leaders like Kagame in Rwanda or Museveni in Uganda are studying Venezuela's playbook: how to balance repression with just enough economic liberalization to avoid total collapse. The West's response has been more sanctions, more moralizing, more demands for regime change. But as I've argued before, sanctions are a tool of last resort, not a strategy. The U.S. Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control has designated over 150 Venezuelan individuals and entities since 2017, yet Maduro's inner circle remains intact. Why? Because sanctions don't target the right people, they hit the population first, and the regime second. When I spoke with a former U.S. intelligence official who worked on Venezuela, he put it: we thought if we squeezed hard enough, the generals would turn on Maduro. Instead, we just made them richer. So what are the alternatives? The first is engagement, but not the kind the U.S. is comfortable with. When the Biden administration briefly eased sanctions in 2022 in exchange for electoral concessions, it was a step in the right direction. But it was also half-hearted. The U.S. lifted restrictions on Chevron's operations, but kept secondary sanctions on the financial sector, ensuring that any real economic recovery would be impossible. That's not diplomacy, it's performative flexibility. If Washington wants to counter Venezuela's model, it needs to offer real debt restructuring, targeted sanctions relief, even a gradual reintegration into the global financial system. But that requires accepting that Maduro isn't going anywhere, at least not in the short term. The second alternative is containment. The U.S. could double down on its efforts to isolate Venezuela, but that would only push Caracas further into the arms of Russia and China. We've already seen this play in 2023. Venezuela signed a $3 billion deal with Iran for oil refinery upgrades, while Russia's Rosneft has been quietly exiting its presence in the Orinoco Belt. China, meanwhile, has extended billions in loans secured by oil, turning Venezuela into a de facto client state. Containment might feel satisfying, but it's a losing strategy. It cedes influence to America's rivals while doing nothing to improve the lives of ordinary Venezuelans. The third option is the most: co-opt the model. If the U.S. can't beat resilient authoritarianism, maybe it can learn from it. That doesn't mean embracing dictatorship, but it does mean recognizing that the old democratic evangelism is dead. The Biden administration's Summit for Democracy in 2021 was a noble idea, but it was also tone-deaf. Inviting countries like the Philippines and Pakistan while excluding Venezuela and Cuba sent a clear: democracy is a tool of U.S. foreign policy, not a universal value. If Washington wants to remain relevant, it needs to engage with the world as it is, not as it wishes it to be. Here's the reflective: Venezuela's moment isn't just about Maduro, or even about Latin America. It's about the end of an era. The post-Cold War order, where the U.S. could impose its will through economic pressure and military might, is over. What comes next isn't a multipolar world, it's a multi-conceptual one, where different systems of governance compete for influence. Venezuela has shown that you don't need to be a superpower to defy the U.S. You just need to be stubborn, adaptive, and willing to endure pain. The question for the West isn't whether it can force Venezuela to change, it's whether it can change itself. Can the U.S. move beyond the binary of democracy versus authoritarianism and accept that the future will be defined by messy, hybrid systems? Can it offer a better deal to countries like Venezuela, one that doesn't require them to choose between sovereignty and prosperity? If not, then Maduro's model won't just survive, it will spread. And that's a future none of us should want.